The letter took her 3 drafts and one entire evening to write, not because Eleanor Marsh struggled with words. She had always been precise with language, had always known how to arrange sentences the way other women arrange flowers with care, with intention, with the understanding that the wrong thing placed in the wrong position ruins everything. No, the first 2 drafts failed, not because she lacked the words, but because they contained the wrong ones. The first draft had hope in it. She burned it over the candle flame without finishing the second line. The second draft had something worse than hope. It had apology, that particular brand of feminine apology she had watched her mother perform for 20 years, the kind that entered a room before you did and asked forgiveness simply for taking up space. She tore that one into pieces small enough that no one could ever reassemble it and read the shame she had put into it. The third draft she wrote standing up at the small desk in the corner of her rented room on Beacon Street with the window cracked despite the September chill, because she needed to feel something cold and honest against her face. She wrote it the way a merchant draws up a contract. She wrote it without ornamentation. She wrote it the way a woman writes something when she has decided finally and without remainder to stop pretending. Mr. Harden, I am answering your advertisement in the Boston Herald dated August 14th. I am 22 years of age. I am in good health with no history of illness. I can cook, keep accounts, and manage a household and work without complaint. I have no family remaining and no debt. I expect nothing romantic from this arrangement. I require only shelter, fair treatment, and the honest fulfillment of whatever terms we agree upon. If these qualifications interest you, I am prepared to travel at your earliest convenience. Eleanor A. Marsh. She read it once. She sealed it before she could change a word. Then she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the small pile of objects on the floor beside her trunk, a stack of journals. 7 of them, their covers worn soft from years of handling. She had kept them since she was 14, filled them with observations, with stories she invented on winter evenings, with the particular kind of longing that lives in a young woman who reads too much and feels everything too deeply. She had filled them with Reginald Ashworth's name more times than she would ever be willing to count. She did not open them again. She stacked them beside the fireplace, and she fed them to it one at a time, watching the pages curl and blacken and disappear. The ink turned colors before it vanished, blue, then green, then nothing. 8 years of her interior life, gone in under 20 minutes. She told herself she felt lighter. She was not entirely sure that was true. She sat for a long time after the last journals was ash, watching the embers breathe and diminish. The room around her was small and cold, and entirely hers in the way that rented rooms are yours temporarily, conditionally on the understanding that someone else owned the walls and could reclaim them at a month's notice. She had lived in this room for 11 months. Before that, in her aunt's house in Charlestown, where she had occupied a spare bedroom, with the permanent awareness of being a burden that Charity had been extended to, rather than a person who belonged there. Before that, in the house on Commonwealth Avenue, where she had grown up, which had been sold to satisfy debts she had not known existed until the solicitors arrived. She was 22 years old, and she had run out of rooms that felt like hers. She looked at the sealed envelope on the desk. She thought, this is either the bravest thing I have ever done or the most desperate. Then she thought, perhaps those are the same thing. She blew out the candle and lay down in the dark and listened to the sounds of Beacon Street below the window, horses' voices, the distant clang of a trolley, and tried to imagine the sounds of a place called Hallbrook, Arizona Territory, and could not. She had looked it up in an atlas at the lending library, a small dot in the southern part of the territory near nothing she had heard of. A vast, pale, unspecific expanse of map that told her nothing about what it actually felt like to stand in it. She supposed she would find out. The train journey from Boston to Arizona Territory took 11 days. 11 days of soot and cinders in the relentless percussion of iron wheels against iron track. 11 days of landscapes changing outside the window, like a slow argument from the dense green of New England to the flat amber patience of the plains to something altogether stranger, something that did not look like anything she had a name for yet. Red rock formations that stood against the sky like monuments to a god she hadn't been introduced to. Distances so vast they made her feel not small exactly, but transparent, as though the land could see straight through her and was unimpressed by what it found. She did not sleep well. She told herself that was the train. In the small hours of the 7th night somewhere in New Mexico Territory, She sat awake with her forehead against the cold glass and allowed herself the one question she had been refusing to ask. What if he is terrible? She had no answer that satisfied her. What she had instead was arithmetic. The arithmetic of a woman with no family, no inheritance, and the specific kind of pride that made domestic service feel like a door she could not walk through without losing something she would never recover. She had the arithmetic of a woman who had been passed over by the world in the particular way the world passes over women who are clever and poor simultaneously, as though the combination is an offense, as though intelligence without money is merely inconvenience. She had the arithmetic of Reginald Ashworth. Reginald had been a clerk in her father's import firm, which meant she had known him for 3 years before he began courting her in earnest. Known him in the peripheral way you know a person who exists in the same institutional orbit, face familiar character, unexamined. When he turned his attention to her deliberately, and with the practiced ease of a man who understood how attention works as currency, she had been flattered in the way a woman is flattered when she has spent most of her life feeling invisible. He had courted her for 6 months with the practiced warmth of a man who had read somewhere that warmth was attractive, and who had disappeared 3 weeks after her father's creditors arrived, and who had married a merchant's daughter in Charlestown before the year was out. Reginald had been handsome. Reginald had been charming. Reginald had said things in the right tone of voice at the right moments, and she had believed every syllable because she had been 20 years old and had not yet learned that some men speak the way actors speak, performing sincerity rather than feeling it. He had told her she was remarkable. He had told her that he admired her mind, her directness, her refusal to be merely decorative. He had said these things in a particular way that made them feel like secrets being entrusted rather than compliments being deployed. She had learned. She had learned after her father died and the debts came to light and the house was sold, and she was carrying 3 trunks to her aunt's spare room in Charlestown, and Reginald Ashworth had sent her a brief, carefully worded letter expressing his sympathy and his regrets and nothing else, absolutely nothing else. And she had understood in the reading of that letter everything that the 6 months before it had actually meant. The letter she sent to Cole Hardin's post office box in Hallbrook, Arizona territory was the evidence of what she had learned. She would not perform anything. She would not offer softness she did not feel. She would show up as exactly what she was capable, clear-eyed, and entirely unwilling to be disappointed again, and they would either build something functional together or they would not. Either outcome she could survive. She had survived worse. She pressed her forehead harder against the cold train window and watched the dark landscape pass and reminded herself that survival was enough. Survival was the goal. Anything beyond survival was the kind of thinking that got women burned and hurt and left with nothing. And she had decided, sitting beside the fireplace with 7 journals turning to ash, that she was done with that kind of thinking. The stars outside the window were enormous. Nothing like Boston stars, which appeared in ones and twos between buildings and cloud cover, faint and apologetic. These stars were everywhere, filling the sky from edge to edge with a profligacy that seemed almost aggressive, as though the universe out here had no concept of restraint. She watched them until the train carried her south and the landscape changed again, and eventually, somewhere in the hours before dawn, she slept. The train pulled into Hallbrook at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in September 1883. The heat was the first thing. Eleanor stepped onto the platform, and the heat came for her like something with intent. It pressed against her wool traveling dress, wholly absurdly unsuitable. She understood that now, and found every layer and penetrated every one of them. And she stood there in the blazing white light of an Arizona afternoon, feeling like a letter that had been placed in the wrong envelope, delivered to the wrong address with no return information. She scanned the platform. She was looking for desperation. That was what she had prepared for. A man worn thin by loneliness or swollen with it, some obvious advertisement of need that would make the transaction feel clean by comparison, would make her the one doing the favor. She had constructed an image of Cole Hardin in the long hours of the train journey, and it was an image built from the word advertisement, from the idea of a man who could not manage his life without assistance, who had resorted to the newspaper to solve a problem that everyone around him had apparently declined to solve for him, and she was looking for that man. She did not find him. What she found instead, separating himself from the shimmer rising off the main street with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the ground beneath his boots would support him, was a man in his early 30s, lean in the way that outdoor work produces, wearing worn denim, and a hat that had been through weather and made something better by it. He moved without performance. There was no swagger in it, no announcement. He simply walked toward her the way a man walks towards something he has decided to meet. He stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat. His eyes were the color of sage after rain, gray-green and direct, and carrying something she could not immediately categorize. Not hunger, not desperation, not the particular kind of loneliness that makes a man reach for whatever is nearest. Something quieter than any of those things. Something patient. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was low and even, and it did not rise at the end the way a question does, and it did not curve toward warmth in the performed way she had been bracing for. It simply stated her name as though confirming a fact. "Mr. Harden," she said. She extended her hand. He shook it firm, brief, treating her hand the way he might treat a business associate's hand, which was exactly what she had wanted and which inexplicably produced in her a small, unwelcome flutter of something she did not acknowledge. "Wagons this way," he said. "I'll get your things." He lifted both her trunks into the wagon bed without visible effort and without comment on their weight. She had been prepared for comment. She had half expected complaint. She received neither. They rode out of Hallbrook in silence northeast into a landscape that grew stranger and more beautiful the farther they went from town, and Eleanor gripped the wagon seat and watched the junipers and the pinyon pines pass and told herself she was not moved by any of it. She was moved by all of it. The scale of the country was unlike anything she had a framework for. In Boston, you were always contained by buildings, by streets, by the human geometry of a city that had been filled in and organized over 200 years. Here the land simply continued in every direction past the limit of what the eye could resolve into specifics, becoming general and immense, and carrying an indifference to human presence that was not hostile exactly, but was certainly not accommodating. You could disappear out here, she thought. You could walk in any direction and keep walking, and the land would absorb you without comment. She was not sure if that terrified her or appealed to her. Possibly both. After perhaps a mile, Cole said without looking at her, "You're wondering why I chose your letter." Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I assumed you would tell me when you were ready." A pause. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but had the same intention. "I received 43 responses," he said. She said nothing. She waited. 42 of them told me about themselves the way a person tells you about themselves when they want you to like them. They were warm letters. Some of them were beautiful letters. Women who wrote about their hopes, about wanting a life with meaning, about believing in love as something that could grow between strangers if they were both willing. He paused. 42 letters asking me to give them something. The wagon rolled over a rut in the road and they both absorbed the jolt without comment. "And then there was yours," he said. Eleanor said nothing. "Yours read like a contract," Cole said. "You listed what you could offer. You stated what you required. You didn't ask me to like you. You didn't offer me warmth you weren't sure you felt yet." He glanced at her, then briefly, and she felt the look more than she saw it. "You treated it like a negotiation between equals." "That is what it is," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it is." He looked back at the road. The horses moved forward into the afternoon heat. "The other 42 letters," Cole said quietly, "told me what those women needed. Yours was the only one that told me what you could do." "I don't need to be needed, Miss Marsh. I need someone who can stand next to me and do the work." Eleanor Marsh, who had sealed a letter and burned her journals and ridden 11 days across a continent, convincing herself she had excised every soft thing from her interior, life felt something open in her chest, tentative and small, and entirely unwelcome, that she spent the next several months refusing to examine. She said, "That is a very practical way of looking at it." "I'm a practical man," Cole Harden said. And then neither of them spoke again for a long time, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her more than the heat and the junipers and the vast impossible sky combined. The Harden Ranch appeared on the horizon like a rumor that turned out to be true. Low buildings clustered around a two-story house that had been built to last, not to impress. The wood was weathered but sound. The corrals were maintained with a kind of care that speaks of someone who understands that neglect compounds. Everything about the property said someone works here. Not works in the desperate, futile way of a man fighting losing odds, but works in the way of a man who has looked at what he has been given and decided every single morning to be worthy of it. Amos Greer was waiting near the barn. He was 55 or close to it, with a face that had been made entirely by weather and time, and the specific expression of a man who has seen enough of life to find most of it interesting. He was not tall, but carried himself with the economical ease of someone who has never wasted emotion in his life. His eyes, when they moved to Eleanor, were the eyes of someone who forms opinions carefully and holds them with quiet conviction. He nodded at her with the contained respect of someone who has learned not to judge too quickly because the first impression is often wrong. Amos has been here 11 years, Cole said as they climbed down from the wagon. He knows this land better than I do. Don't exaggerate, Amos said, but he said it without any edge. Cole showed Eleanor through the house. It was clean in the way a man's house is clean when he has genuinely tried to prepare it for another person's arrival. Swept floors, a window in the kitchen that faced east and would catch the morning light, a room upstairs with a real bed and a wardrobe and a washstand with a pitcher painted with small blue flowers, which struck her as an oddly specific tenderness for a man who described himself as practical. Your room, Cole said, setting her trunks down. Mine's at the end of the hall, washroom between. He said it plainly without elaboration, but the plainness of it was itself a statement. This is yours, that is mine. The arrangement is as I described it in my letters. No territory claimed, no unspoken expectation hanging in the air like smoke. Eleanor stood in the center of the small room and looked out the window at the eastern pastures where cattle grazed in the long afternoon light beneath a sky so unreasonably blue it seemed almost argumentative. Thank you, she said, and she meant it with a specificity she hadn't anticipated. Cole looked at her for a moment in the way he had looked at her in the wagon, direct and unhurried, and carrying that quality she still couldn't quite name. I meant what I wrote, he said, about wanting a partner, not someone to manage, not someone who feels like they owe me something. Whatever else this arrangement is or isn't, you'll be treated with respect in this house. That's not a courtesy. That's just what's right. Eleanor looked away from the window. She looked at his face, sun-darkened, angled, patient, and she recognized that he was not performing this. He was stating it the same way he had stated everything else, as fact. I intend to do my share, she said. I know you do, he said. That's why you're here. He left her to unpack, and she stood alone in the room for a long time, not unpacking. Just standing there listening to the strange silence of a place that had none of the sounds she had grown up with, and all of the sounds she hadn't known existed. Wind through dry grass, the distant low of cattle, the creak of the house settling in the afternoon heat. A bird she couldn't identify, called once from somewhere to the south, and then was silent. She thought, I am somewhere I have never been, with someone I do not know, in a life I chose because the alternatives were worse. And then, surprising herself, she thought, it could have been much, much worse than this. The wedding was held on a Wednesday. Reverend Moss came through Hallbrook twice a month, a thin man with wire spectacles and the practiced solemnity of someone who has presided over enough beginnings to know that most of them are more complicated than they appear. The ceremony took place in the small Hallbrook church with Amos Greer and Mrs. Dorothea Finch, a widow who ran the dry goods store and who had arrived with a small bunch of wildflowers that she pressed into Eleanor's hands without asking as witnesses. Cole wore a pressed white shirt and dark trousers. He had shaved. He stood at the front of the church with the same quality of stillness he seemed to carry everywhere. And when Eleanor walked up the aisle in her best dress, dove gray silk 2 years out of Boston fashion, he watched her come without pretense, without the performed expression of a man trying to look moved. He simply watched her as though she were something he was trying to understand. Do you, Cole Benjamin Harden, take Eleanor Ann Marsh? I do. No hesitation, eyes steady. Do you, Eleanor Ann Marsh, take Cole Benjamin Harden? She breathed once. She thought of the letter she had sealed. She thought of the journal she had burned. I do. The ring he placed on her finger was a plain gold band, narrow and unadorned, and when she looked up at him, after the Reverend pronounced them married, he said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Hello, Eleanor. It was not romantic. It was not performed. It was a man acknowledging that something had just changed and that he was present for the change, and that he intended to honor it. "Hello, Cole," she said. Mrs. Finch wiped her eyes. Amos looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has feelings about the occasion, but no intention of displaying them. Reverend Moss moved on to the paperwork with professional efficiency. They signed the marriage certificate. They shook hands with their witnesses. They walked out into the September afternoon as husband and wife, and the heat received them without ceremony, and the sky above Hallbrook was exactly what it had been before the ceremony, immense and blue, and entirely indifferent to the small human business that had just been transacted beneath it. Eleanor looked at the ring on her finger, plain and solid and real. "I got it from the jeweler in town last week," Cole said, following her gaze. "I can have it adjusted if it doesn't fit right." "It fits," she said, and it did in every sense she was yet capable of understanding. The days that followed had a texture Eleanor had not anticipated. She had expected difficulty. She had expected the friction of two strangers negotiating shared space, the small, daily collisions of different habits in different rhythms. She had prepared herself for that friction the way you prepare for weather coat buttoned, head down forward motion, regardless. What she had not prepared for was the ease. Not the ease of familiarity. They were still strangers, fundamentally still moving around each other with the careful courtesy of people who have not yet established where the edges are. But the ease of two people who are at their core similarly organized, who approach a problem and see the same problem, who can sit in silence without filling it with noise. Cole taught her to manage the kitchen stove, which had opinions. He taught her the particular language of the ranch's account books, which his father had started in 1871, and which recorded not just numbers, but decisions, why a pasture was rested, why a particular bull was purchased, the reasoning behind each choice laid out in careful script. He explained the water system, the rotation of grazing land, the way the weather moved across the territory from the southwest, in patterns that could be read if you paid attention. He never talked down to her. He never simplified. He explained things the way he would explain them to Amos, assuming competence, leaving room for questions, not filling the silence with reassurance. It was the most respectful way she had ever been taught anything. She in turn discovered that she had a talent for numbers that she had never had the occasion to fully exercise. She reorganized the account books within the first week in a way that made the quarterly patterns visible at a glance. And when she showed Cole what she had done, he studied it for a long moment and then said simply, "That's better than how I had it." That was all. But she felt it land in her chest like something warm. She learned to make bread that didn't emerge from the oven with the density of consequence. She learned the names of the horses Samson, the big bay Cole rode, Daisy, the gentle gray mare who regarded Eleanor with the patient tolerance of a teacher with a new student, a small sorrel named Pepper, who had strong opinions about everything and communicated them clearly to anyone within range. She learned the rhythm of the ranch's days, which began before light and ended after dark, and filled the hours between with a quality of purposeful motion she found unexpectedly satisfying. There was something almost meditative about useful work in a place this beautiful. She had not expected that. She had expected hardship, and she found it in the physical demands, in the climate, in the foreignness of everything around her. But she found mixed in with it a quality of meaning that her life in Boston, even before it fell apart, had never quite managed to provide. In Boston, she had existed. Here she was beginning to understand she was doing something. Mrs. Dorothea Finch came by on the second Saturday with preserves and a loaf of bread and the frank friendliness of a woman who does not have time for anything but honesty. "Cole Harden is a good man," she said, settling herself at the kitchen table with the authority of someone who has sat at many kitchen tables and knows exactly how much space to take. "Not a flashy man, not a man who'll tell you what you want to hear for the sake of telling you, but the kind of man who keeps his words so consistently that you forget it could ever be otherwise." "I'm beginning to see that," Eleanor said carefully. "He's been alone a long time," Mrs. Finch said. "Not as accusation, as information. Doesn't ask for help. Doesn't talk about what costs him. You'll have to pay attention to the silences if you want to know what's happening underneath." Eleanor said nothing. She poured tea and handed a cup across the table. "I'm not looking to pry," Mrs. Finch added. "I just like to make sure the women who come here know what they've got. Some of them come expecting something easy. Some of them come expecting something terrible." She looked at Eleanor over the rim of her cup with eyes that had seen considerable amounts of both truth and nonsense. You don't seem like either kind. I came expecting a transaction, Eleanor said, and a pause. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in the pasture, and the sound it made was nothing like Boston. Nothing like anything she had a name for yet. And it may be somewhat more complicated than that, Eleanor said. Mrs. Finch smiled and said nothing, which was the most eloquent response available. It was Amos who told her about the promise. 3 weeks after the wedding, on a Thursday evening, when Cole had ridden out to check the far pasture, and Eleanor was hanging washing on the line behind the house, Amos appeared with a bucket and no particular urgency and began working on a section of fence that needed attention nearby. They worked in the same silence that seemed to characterize everything on the Hardin Ranch, comfortable, undemanding, not requiring to be filled. Then Amos said, "You're wondering what made a man like Cole put an advertisement in a Boston newspaper." Eleanor pinned a shirt to the line without looking at him. "I assumed there weren't many options locally." "There weren't," Amos said, "but that's not why he did it." He set down his bucket and leaned against the fence box with the ease of a man who has learned to make every pause in labor a small rest rather than a waste. Cole's father died in the spring of 1880, Amos said. Pneumonia came on fast. Cole sat with him 3 days at the end. Eleanor was still. The wind moved the wet shirts on the line. The old man, his name was Robert, he built this place from nothing. Came out in '69 with $40 and a quarter section of scrub, land that nobody else wanted because it looked like it would never amount to anything. Amos paused. Took him 12 years to make it what it is. 12 years of work, and that would have broken most men before the 5th year. His wife worked alongside him for every one of those years. She passed 2 years after Robert did. Cole buried them both before he was 30. Cole told me something about his father, Eleanor said. Did he tell you the last thing Robert said to him? She shook her head. Amos was quiet for a moment. The sound of cattle from the far pasture drifted in on the afternoon air, low and continuous, the sound of living animals going about their living. Robert Hardin looked at his son from that sickbed, and he said, "Don't let this place die with you, Cole. Don't you let what I built turn to dust because you were too stubborn or too lonely to ask for help building the next part." Amos picked up his bucket, and then he was gone. Eleanor stood very still. Cole didn't act on it for 3 years, Amos continued. He kept telling himself he'd figure something out. Meanwhile, he was working 16-hour days trying to do alone what it takes 2 people to do, and the house was getting emptier, and the winters were getting longer, and I could see it wearing on him in ways he'd never have put into words. He glanced at her. Cole isn't a man who complains, which means by the time you'd know something was wrong, it would have been wrong for a long time. He put the advertisement in, Eleanor said. He put the advertisement in last November. Told me he felt like a fool doing it. Told me it was probably going to come to nothing. Amos almost smiled. Then the letters started coming. The wind shifted, and the shirts on the line moved with it, pale shapes pivoting and settling. He picked yours because it was honest, Amos said. But I think there was something else in it too. Something he didn't say to me directly, but that I understood. He paused. That letter read like it was written by someone who also needed to keep a promise. Just a different kind. He picked up his tools and moved on down the fence line, and Eleanor stood there between the wet washing and the afternoon sky, with her hands at her sides, understanding something she had not expected to understand, that this man she had married for survival had married her for something that was also in its own language about survival. That the transaction she had proposed and the obligation he was honoring were not as different from each other as she had thought. She had come here because she had run out of other choices. He had placed the advertisement in because he had made a promise to his father's memory. They were both in their own way trying to keep something alive. She stood at the clothesline for a long time after Amos had gone, looking out at the ranch, the corrals, the barn, the house with its eastward-facing kitchen window, the south pasture where the creek ran year-round through the cottonwoods. Robert Hardin had come here in 1869 with $40 and a conviction that this unpromising ground could become something. He had spent 11 years asking the land to cooperate, and it had answered. She thought of her own father, who had built something too, a business, a reputation, a household, and who had died with it all in debt, unable to sustain it, leaving behind a daughter with no map and no money and no idea how to begin. She thought at least he tried. Then she thought, I am trying too. She took the dry washing off the line and carried it inside. She found him the night before the first hard frost. She had been in the house. She hadn't been able to sleep, which was not unusual. The strange sounds of the desert night, still foreign enough to keep her half alert. And she had come downstairs for water and seen through the kitchen window a single lantern burning in the direction of the stable. She went out. The night was cold and brilliant, the stars so numerous and close they seemed to belong to a different arrangement of the universe than the one she had grown up under in Boston. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked across the yard, her boots leaving dark marks in the dew on the grass, and stopped at the open stable door. Cole was inside. He stood beside Samson, one hand on the horse's neck, speaking in a voice too low for her to catch the words from where she stood. Not giving commands, not managing, just talking the way a man talks to something he trusts, with things he won't say anywhere else. His back was to her. The lantern threw his shadow long across the straw and up the wall of the stable, a stretched and wavering version of him that seemed larger than the man himself. She caught a few words, his father's name, something about the south pasture, something that sounded like I'm trying, and then quieter in a voice that had lost every trace of the careful steadiness he maintained during the day. I don't know if I'm doing this right. She stood in the stable door in the cold Arizona night, and she listened to a man who had promised his dead father he would not let the work die, he admitting to a horse in the small hours that he was uncertain, that the confidence she had read in his stride since the moment he walked toward her at the train station was not the absence of doubt. It was a decision made in spite of it. Every single morning, a decision. She had come here expecting a transaction. She had come prepared to deal with a man's need to make herself useful in exchange for security, to manage her own vulnerability with the precision of a lawyer reviewing a contract. She had not been prepared for this, for a man who was also trying, who was also uncertain, who also had something to protect and didn't know with certainty that he could protect it. A man who was not performing capability but exercising it daily in the face of doubt he would not share with anyone who might be watching. She stepped back from the stable door before he could turn and see her. She walked back to the house in the dark, in the brilliant cold, under the implausible stars, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time without lighting a candle. She had burned her journals because she had decided that the part of herself which felt things too deeply was a liability, a weakness, evidence of a naivety she could not afford. She had decided, sitting beside that Boston fireplace, that the woman who had believed Reginald Ashworth's performance of sincerity was a woman who needed to be replaced with someone harder and more careful and less inclined to hope. But sitting in Cole Hardin's dark kitchen on the edge of his land in Arizona territory, 3 weeks into a marriage she had constructed from pure pragmatism, Eleanor Marsh began to wonder, not for the first time, but for the first time with any real seriousness, whether she had burned the wrong things. Perhaps it was not feeling that had made her vulnerable. Perhaps it was simply that she had been feeling in the wrong direction toward a man who was performing rather than being. Perhaps the capacity to feel deeply was not the flaw she had decided it was. Perhaps it was in fact exactly what allowed her to stand at a stable door in the dark and understand with complete accuracy what she had just witnessed. The frost came before morning. She could see it on the grass when the sun rose thin and silver and temporary, already beginning to melt, as the light strengthened, already becoming something else. She put the coffee on. Cole came in from the morning chores, and she handed him a cup without either of them speaking, and they stood at the kitchen window and watched the frost disappear into the warming day, and the silence between them had a different quality than it had 3 weeks ago. Less like the silence of strangers, more like the silence of people who are beginning slowly and without announcement to recognize each other. The first snow came in December, thin and uncertain, more suggestion than commitment. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched it fall soft and directionless, dissolving before it reached the ground, and thought that it looked nothing like Boston snow. Boston snow arrived with conviction. It accumulated. It changed the city into something that required different navigation, different clothing, different strategy. This Arizona snow was something else entirely. It fell and disappeared. Fell and disappeared as though testing whether it was welcome before deciding to stay. She understood the feeling. She had been at the Hardin Ranch for 3 months. The woman who had stepped off the train in September, rigid in her wool dress, clutching the practical certainty of a transaction like a shield, had been replaced by someone she was still in the process of meeting. Someone who knew the name of every horse and most of the cattle. Someone who had reorganized the ranch accounts and identified a pattern in the grazing rotation that Cole had not noticed, and that once corrected would save 40 acres of prime grass from being worked too hard. Someone who had learned to read the sky the way Amos read it, watching the Southwest, feeling the pressure change, understanding that weather in this country announced itself in advance if you were paying attention. Someone who had stopped bracing quite so hard for disappointment, not stopped entirely. Eleanor Marsh had not become careless, but the constant tension of it, the held breath anticipation of the moment when something would reveal itself as worse than it appeared, had begun incrementally to ease. The way a fist eases open when it has been clenched long enough that the hand simply runs out of strength to maintain it. Cole noticed. He said nothing about it, which was his way. He registered things with his eyes and let them settle before he addressed them, if he addressed them at all. But she would sometimes catch him watching her with a look that contained something she had not seen directed at her in a very long time. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter and more durable than admiration. Recognition. As though he was watching someone return from somewhere and was too careful to make a fuss about it in case the acknowledgement drove them back. Hector Vane rode onto the property on the second Tuesday of December. Eleanor saw him coming from the kitchen window, a heavy-set man on a gray horse moving with the proprietary ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being received as a consequence rather than an inconvenience. He wore the kind of coat that announced money in the particular way that frontier money announces itself, not through refinement, but through sheer material quantity. Everything about Hector Vane was more than necessary, more horse than required for the journey, more men than required for a social call. Two riders flanked him at a distance, staying back the way dogs stay back when they've been trained to look casual while remaining ready. Cole came out of the barn before Vane reached the house. Eleanor stayed at the window. She watched the exchange with the attention of someone who has learned to read the space between words, the posture of it, the geometry. Cole stood his ground without squaring up, his weight balanced, and settled his hands easy at his sides. Vane talked more than Cole responded. There was a quality to Vane's gesturing that she recognized, the gestures of a man accustomed to explaining terms rather than negotiating them. At one point he gestured toward the southern pasture, toward the direction of the creek, and something in the gesture had the quality of a man indicating something he already considers his. Cole's posture did not change. He said something short. Vane said something longer. Then Vane touched the brim of his hat in the parody of courtesy and turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, his two riders peeling away with him like a closing bracket. Cole stood in the yard for a moment after they left. Just stood there looking at nothing in particular, with the contained stillness of a man processing something he does not intend to share without deciding how much of it is worth sharing. Then he turned and came inside. "Vane," he said by way of explanation. Eleanor poured coffee and set it on the table without being asked. "I gathered." Cole sat down. He turned the cup in his hands. Outside, the snow was still failing to commit to anything. "His family owns most of the land between here and Tucson," Cole said. "Has for about 12 years. He's been buying up parcels whenever anyone has trouble, drought, debt, bad season. Waits for the moment when a man has run out of options and then arrives with an offer that isn't really an offer." "What did he want?" Cole looked at the cup. "He bought a debt." The words landed quietly in the kitchen. "My father borrowed $400 from a bank in Tucson in 1879, Cole said. "Needed it to get through a bad winter, lost 30 head to a fever that came through in November. Needed cash to hold through until spring. He paid most of it back. There was a balance remaining when he died." A pause. $160. "I've been paying it down slowly. The bank had it noted as a performing account." "But the bank sold the account," Eleanor said. Cole looked at her steadily. Something in his expression confirmed that she had understood immediately what that meant. "Vane bought it last month," Cole said. "He's not interested in the $160. He's interested in the water rights clause my father signed as collateral, the creek that runs through the south pasture." He stopped. Set down the cup. Without that creek, we can't summer the herd. The grazing land is useless without the water. We'd have to sell down to a fraction of what we run or watch them die in July. The kitchen was quiet. Eleanor thought about the account books she had reorganized. She thought about the water system. She thought about the specific line in the 1871 ledger, the one written in Robert Hardin's careful hand, recording the purchase of the quarter section, and including in the margin a note she had read and passed over without understanding its significance at the time. A note about a survey, a note about boundaries, a note about the creek. "How did your father originally establish the water rights?" she asked. Cole looked at her. "What do you mean when he first filed the land claim in 1869? How did he establish the right to use that creek?" Cole thought about it. "There was a federal land grant, the original homestead filing. Where are those documents?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father kept everything. There's a strong box in the storage room off the kitchen. I haven't gone through it thoroughly. Most of what I needed for daily operations was in the account books." Eleanor stood up. "I'll start there," she said. Cole looked at her with an expression that was new. Not the careful recognition of recent weeks, but something more immediate. Something that resembled the look of a man who has been standing in front of a problem so long that it has become part of the landscape, and who has just been reminded that landscapes can be changed. "Eleanor," he said. She stopped. "Vane has lawyers in Tucson," Cole said. "He has money and time and the specific kind of patience that comes from knowing you have more of both than the other man. This isn't something that gets fixed by finding the right piece of paper." She looked at him steadily. "It might be something that gets started that way." He held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly. She went through Robert Hardin's strongbox alone over 3 evenings while Cole did the necessary work of the ranch and tried not to ask her about it more than once a day. The strongbox contained a life compressed into paper. Land filing certificates, letters from the Federal Land Office, a deed in faded ink dated September 1869, a handwritten survey description that had been recorded by someone named Matthias Grubb, Survey Agent, Territory of Arizona, in October of the same year. Cole's parents' marriage record, a photograph of 2 people standing in front of a half-built structure that would become the main house, squinting into light, looking like people who have decided something and are not looking back. A small folded paper that turned out to be a list in a woman's handwriting of seeds she intended to plant in the spring of 1870. Eleanor looked at it for a long time before putting it back. And there at the bottom of the box, beneath a folded letter from the Department of the Interior dated 1871, a document that made Eleanor stop breathing for a moment. It was a water rights adjudication, filed in 1871 by Robert Hardin, witnessed by 2 homesteaders whose names she didn't recognize, and certified by a territorial official whose stamp was still legible after 12 years. It established in language that was plain and absolute and had the quality of something driven into the ground like a fence post, that the water rights to the creek designated in Survey Lot 14, Section 7, Township 12, South Range 18 East were appurtenant to the land, attached to the land permanently, not separable from it, not collateral that could be borrowed against or sold independently because they were not an asset that existed independently of the property itself. Hector Vane had bought a debt. He had not bought a water right because the water right was not the bank's to sell. Eleanor sat in the storage room with the document in her hands and the lantern burning and the cold coming in through the gap under the door. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the clean, specific satisfaction of a problem understood completely. Not a problem partially solved, not a problem identified, but a problem whose entire shape was visible, whose solution was present and documented and real. She did not tell Cole that night. She needed to be certain first. She needed someone who knew the relevant law to confirm what she believed she was reading. And she needed to think carefully about how to use it, because a document is only as useful as the person wielding it understands it to be. The next morning, she told Cole she wanted to go into Hallbrook for supplies. She went to Hallbrook. She also rode the additional 6 miles to the office of a lawyer named Aldous Pemberton, who had practiced territorial law for 14 years and who listened to Eleanor Hardin. She used her married name properly at the door, with the focused attention of a man whose livelihood depends on listening carefully to what people are actually saying rather than what they think they're saying. She laid the document on his desk. Aldous Pemberton read it twice. Then he looked up at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has just been handed the winning card in an argument he didn't know he was playing. "Mrs. Harden," he said, "where did you find this?" "In my father-in-law's papers," she said. "Is it what I think it is?" He looked at it a third time. Then he sat back in his chair. "Yes," he said, "it is exactly what you think it is." And she asked him to say nothing about his involvement until she told him otherwise, paid his initial consultation from the household account she managed, and rode back to the ranch through the cold December air, with the original document tucked inside her coat against her chest. She said nothing to Cole that evening. She said nothing the following week as Vane's lawyers sent a formal letter to the ranch establishing their legal claim to the water rights and offering to settle the underlying debt in exchange for a formal water usage agreement that would have required Cole to petition Vane's permission every summer for access to his own creek. She watched Cole read the letter at the kitchen table. She watched him fold it carefully and set it down with the particular controlled stillness of a man who is managing something that has moved past anger into the territory of grief, because this was not just a legal dispute. This was his father's land, his father's creek. The water his father had dug channels for and coaxed across dry ground and used to grow the grass that fed the herd that justified every year of work Robert Harden had given to this piece of the earth. Cole looked at the letter for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I'm going to write back and tell them we dispute the claim." "Good," Eleanor said. He looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized, the same thing she had seen the night she had stood at the stable door and heard him speak honestly into the dark. Not the strong man performing strength, the man underneath doing his best. She nearly told him then. She stopped herself, not because she didn't trust him with it, because she needed to know without the knowledge changing the equation whether she could do this. Whether the woman who had arrived in September with nothing but competence and calculation had enough of both left to matter when it counted. Reginald Ashworth arrived in Holbrook on the third Wednesday of January. Eleanor did not know he was there until Mrs. Finch appeared at the ranch door on Thursday morning with a face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they expect to be unwelcome. "There's a man in town," Mrs. Finch said, settling herself at the kitchen table. "Arrived yesterday on the stage from Tucson. Well-dressed man, Eastern manners. He's been asking questions." Eleanor kept her hands steady around her coffee cup. "What kind of questions?" "About you," Mrs. Finch said. "About the ranch, about Cole." A pause. "He told the man at the hotel that he was an old friend of yours from Boston. Said he'd come a long way to make sure you were all right." Something cold moved through Eleanor's chest. Not surprised Reginald Ashworth had been fading from the foreground of her interior life over the preceding months, the way things fade when you stop giving them your attention. But she had not forgotten him. You do not forget the specific shape of the disappointment that changed you. "His name is Reginald Ashworth," she said. Mrs. Finch nodded once, confirming. "He's not a friend," Eleanor said. "I didn't think so," Mrs. Finch said. "He has the quality of a man who expects to be received as something he isn't." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She looked out the kitchen window at the winter pasture, at the frost-gray grass and the pale sky, and the creek in the distance visible from here as a line of darker vegetation threading through the pale land. The creek. "Did he ask specifically about the ranch?" Eleanor said. "About the property?" Mrs. Finch was quiet for a beat too long. "He had a conversation with one of Vane's men at the hotel bar," she said carefully. "I have that on good authority." The cold in Eleanor's chest clarified into something sharper and cleaner. Anger, yes, but underneath it, understanding. The particular understanding of a woman who has already been through one education in how men calculate. Reginald Ashworth had not come across the continent out of concern for her well-being. He appeared at the ranch on Friday afternoon. Cole was in the far pasture. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts when she heard the horse and looked up and saw him through the window, still handsome in the careful, maintained way of men who consider their appearance an investment. Still wearing the expression of thoughtful consideration he had worn throughout 6 months of courtship in Boston, which she now understood was not thoughtfulness, but the performance of it. She went to the door before he knocked. "Eleanor." He said her name the way he had always said it, with a particular inflection that suggested ownership, as though the word were a room he had furnished and expected to find unchanged. You look well. This place agrees with you. She looked at him with the full and undistracted clarity of someone who has had several months to remember accurately who a person actually is rather than who she had needed them to be. This was not the man she had mourned. This was the man who had produced the man she had mourned, the performer, not the performance. Reginald, she said, why are you here? Not a question, a demand for accounting. He smiled. He had always had a good smile. She had not been wrong about that. I heard you'd come west. I was concerned. The circumstances of your leaving Boston were what, she said, were the circumstances of a woman who made the best decision available to her with the information she had at the time. His expression adjusted. The smile remained, but something underneath it recalibrated. I made a mistake, he said, leaving the way I did. Without, you made a calculation, Eleanor said. You calculated that my father's debt made me a liability and that Caroline Whitmore's father's money made her an asset. That's not a mistake, Reginald. That's arithmetic. You were always very good at arithmetic. He was quiet. The smile was gone now. What replaced it was something more honest, the face of a man deciding whether to continue performing or to try something closer to the truth. My marriage to Caroline ended 6 months ago, he said. I know, Eleanor said. Mrs. Finch is well informed. A pause. I came because I heard about the water dispute, Reginald said. And there it was, the thing underneath, arriving now without the performance, without the warmth he had deployed so effectively for 6 months in Boston. Vane has been buying up contested properties across the territory. I have connections in Tucson, legal contacts. I thought perhaps I could help, Eleanor said. Yes. In exchange for what? He looked at her. He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. You came here, Eleanor said, because you heard that this ranch is in a legal dispute over water rights. You have connections to Vane's circle, I know that now. And you believed that if you arrived with your charm and your Eastern manners and your implication of concern, I would be grateful enough, or lonely enough, or frightened enough to give you access to information or influence that you could use. She paused. The man who courted me for my father's business connections is now courting me for my husband's land dispute. The silence between them had weight. The arithmetic hasn't changed, Eleanor said. Only the asset. Reginald looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the house at the kitchen window, at the interior of a life she was building with someone else. Whatever he found when he looked at it, satisfaction, regret, the particular calculation of a man reassessing a position she did not particularly care. You've changed, he said. Yes, she said, I have. She did not tell him to leave. She didn't need to. He could see it in the way she was standing, not performing firmness, not reaching for it. Standing in it naturally, the way you stand in ground, you have earned through the slow work of months, not the sudden declaration of a single moment. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned his horse. He rode back toward Hallbrook, and she watched him go, without a single part of her wanting to call after him, and the absence of that want, the clean, complete absence of it, felt like something being finished that had needed to be finished for a long time. Not the dramatic rupture she had experienced in Boston when she understood he was gone for good. Something quieter and more complete than that. The closing of a book she had already read and set down, the recognition that she would not be picking it up again. She stood in the yard until he was out of sight. Then she went inside and put the kettle on and sat down at the kitchen table and opened the account book to the page she had been working on and continued. That evening she told Cole. Not everything, not the details of the conversation, not what Reginald had said about himself or what she had said back, but the essential facts: who he was, why he had come, what she believed his connection to Vane's operation to be. Cole listened without interrupting. He was very still while she spoke, the particular stillness of a man filing information, carefully putting it in the right order, not reacting until he has understood the whole shape of something. When she finished, he said, Are you all right? She looked at him. Yes. Not a performance of all right, he said quietly. Actually, she considered this, considered the fact that he knew the difference that he was asking, because he had paid enough attention to her to know there was a difference. Actually, she said. Yes. He nodded once. He looked at the table for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking through something he would not speak until it was complete. He's gone, Cole said. He's gone. Cole said nothing more about it that night, but later when she was passing through the living room toward the stairs, she noticed that he had moved his chair, the reading chair he kept near the fireplace slightly, so that it faced the window that overlooked the road from Hallbrook. Just slightly, just enough. She said nothing about it either. The letter from Aldous Pemberton arrived in the first week of February. Eleanor intercepted it at the post office in Hallbrook herself on a Tuesday when she had driven in for supplies. She read it in the wagon before she started back with the cold winter light, flat and honest over the page. Pemberton had done what she asked. He had researched the adjudication document, confirmed its validity under territorial law, consulted with a colleague in the federal land office in Prescott, and drafted a formal legal response to Vane's claim. The response was direct and documented and rested on a foundation that Vane's lawyers Pemberton wrote with a restrained satisfaction she could read between every line were not going to be able to argue their way around. The water rights were appurtenant to the land. They had been appurtenant to the land since 1871. They were not collateral. They were not separable. They could not be claimed through the purchase of a debt because they were not an asset that existed independently of the property. Hector Vane had purchased for whatever he had paid the legal right to pursue repayment of $160. He had not purchased the creek. Eleanor folded the letter and put it inside her coat. She drove back to the ranch through the cold February afternoon. The sky was that particular winter blue, deep and cloudless, the kind of blue that looks like it goes on forever and probably does. The creek glittered in the low light as she crossed the wooden bridge at the south edge of the property, dark water moving over pale stones, indifferent to everything that had been negotiated over it. She stopped the wagon on the bridge and looked at the water for a long moment. Robert Hardin had dug the first channel with a hand spade in the summer of 1870, alone in temperatures over 100 degrees, asking the land to cooperate with him. The land had answered. She released the brake and drove on. She unhitched the wagon. She put the supplies away. She made supper. Cole came in from the pasture with Amos, and they ate together at the big table the way they had begun to do on cold evenings, the three of them easy in the particular companionship of people who work together and have stopped pretending that the work is the only thing connecting them. After supper, Amos said goodnight and went to the bunkhouse. Cole stayed at the table with his coffee. Eleanor took the letter from her coat pocket and laid it on the table in front of him. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "Read it," she said. He picked it up. She watched his face while he read, watched the stillness of it, the careful attention. Watched the moment partway through the second page when the quality of his stillness changed. Not visibly to anyone who didn't know how to look, but she knew how to look. A barely perceptible alteration like the moment before dawn, when the darkness is still dark, but has lost some quality of absolute that it will not recover. He read to the end. He set the letter down. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not the careful, patient recognition of the past few months. It was something more direct than that. Something that had moved past recognition into acknowledgement, and past acknowledgement into something that had no clean name in the vocabulary of transactions. "The strong box," he said. "Your father kept everything," she said. "You've been working on this since December." "Since the night Vane rode in," she said. Cole was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the wind had picked up from the southwest, a change in the weather coming in overnight. "You didn't tell me," he said. "No." "Why?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "Because I needed to know I could," she said. "And because I was afraid that if I told you and it didn't work, it would be worse than if I had just kept quiet and tried." A pause. "And perhaps because I wanted to do something for this place, not for the transaction, not for the arrangement." She looked at the letter between them on the table. "For something I've started to think of as mine." The wind moved around the corners of the house. The fire in the sitting room settled with a sound like a word spoken quietly. Cole Hardin looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the February dark, and the expression on his face was not gratitude, exactly though it contained gratitude. It was the expression of a man who has been trying to honor a promise and who has just discovered without expecting it that he was not, after all, keeping it alone. He did not say anything large. He did not make a speech of it. He was not a man who made speeches. He reached across the table and placed his hand briefly over hers, warm and rough and certain, and then he took it back and picked up his coffee cup. "I'll write to Pemberton tomorrow," he said, "to authorize him to proceed. He'll need Cole Hardin's signature," Eleanor said. "It's your land." "Our land," Cole said, simply, without elaboration. The word landed in the kitchen like something set down after a long carry, something that had been heavy for some time and was now resting. Neither of them picked it up and examined it. They left it there between the letter and the coffee cups and the sound of the February wind finding the gaps in the old wood of the house, and it stayed there long after they had gone to bed, continuing to mean what it meant in the dark. Vane's lawyers received Pemberton's response in the third week of February. They did not respond for 10 days. Eleanor counted the days, though she did not mention that she was counting. On the 11th day, a brief letter arrived acknowledging the existence of the 1871 adjudication and declining to pursue the claim further. It was written in the flat, evacuated language of lawyers extracting themselves from a losing position. No admission, no apology, no acknowledgement of what the document meant. Simply a withdrawal. Hector Vane had bought a debt. He collected his $160, which Pemberton arranged to be paid in full, through the appropriate channels, and he did not appear on the Hardin property again. Amos, when informed, said, "Good." Then he went back to work. Cole read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the strongbox with his father's papers. That night at supper, Eleanor set a wildflower, the first one she had found that year, still half frozen, discovered at the base of the cottonwoods along the creek bank, in a small jar on the table. She said nothing about it. Cole said nothing about it. But she saw him look at it once with the expression of a man who understands exactly what is being said, and she felt a particular satisfaction of having communicated something important in the right language. The fever came for Eleanor in the middle of March. Without warning, the way fevers come one evening, she was fine, and by midnight she was not fine at all, burning and shaking in the particular way that makes the body feel like foreign territory, like something you inhabit rather than something you are. She did not call out. That was the first thing. She lay in her room and tried to manage it quietly, the way she had managed everything quietly for as long as she could remember, the way a woman learns to be sick without making it anyone else's problem. She had been managing things quietly for so long, it had become a reflex she no longer noticed. The instinct to contain, to not require to handle whatever was happening without asking anyone else to set down what they were carrying. She did not hear Cole in the hallway. She did not hear the door open, but she became aware of him sitting in the chair by the window, not sleeping, not pretending to sleep. Present. A glass of water appeared on the nightstand at some point. A damp cloth appeared on her forehead in the long, hot confusion of the night. She heard him go downstairs and come back. She heard him talking to Amos very quietly through the door at some point before dawn. She drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep. At one point, the hour just before the sky began to lighten, when darkness is most itself before it starts its slow retreat, she was clear enough to see him sitting in the chair fully dressed, watching her with the steady attention of a man determined not to miss the moment when he was needed. "You should sleep," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "I'm fine," he said. "Cole." "Eleanor," he said with perfect equanimity. She looked at the ceiling. The fever was still present but had lost some of its violence. The room felt less like it was moving. "I'm not going to disappear," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not worried about that." "Then while—" "Because you spent 3 months worrying about something and carrying it alone," he said, "so that I wouldn't have to. The least I can do is sit in a chair." She had no answer for that. She lay in the gray pre-dawn of a March morning in Arizona territory, in the house that was beginning to feel like home, with the man she had married for survival sitting 3 feet away because he had decided that was where he should be. Not because the transaction required it, not because any arrangement between them demanded it, because he wanted to. She closed her eyes. For the first time since she had stepped onto a train in Boston with 2 trunks and a letter, and the last of her willingness to hope, she let herself be taken care of without calculating the cost of it, without measuring what it meant or what it would require of her in return, without the careful management of her own reception of kindness that had become so habitual, she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She simply let it be what it was. Outside, the first birds of morning began their noise. The sky changed color, slow and certain, the way it always did in this country, without apology, without asking permission, becoming what it was going to become, regardless of what the night before had been. Spring was coming. Everything quietly was beginning to shift. The morning Cole found the papers, Eleanor was in the east pasture with Daisy. She had ridden out early before the summer heat made the air something you had to negotiate with rather than simply breathe, following the line of the creek south where it bent through the cottonwoods and emerged into open grassland. The water was running well, it always ran well now, and she never crossed that wooden bridge at the south edge of the property without feeling the quiet satisfaction of something defended and kept. Hector Vane had not appeared at the ranch since Pemberton's legal response had reached his lawyers in February. He had not written. He had not sent riders. He had, as Amos put it, with characteristic economy folded. The summer of 1884 was the best the Hardin Ranch had seen in 3 years. The grass was deep and the water was reliable, and the herd had come through the winter with fewer losses than the 2 winters before it. Cole moved through his days with a quality Eleanor recognized now. Not the forced forward motion of a man honoring an obligation, but the grounded ease of a man who has looked at what he is building and found it worthy of the effort. She pulled Daisy to a stop at the creek bend and let the horse drink. The cottonwood leaves turned in the morning air, above her silver on one side and green on the other, flickering between the two, the way things flicker when they cannot decide what they are. She had been trying to describe that specific light in her notebook. The notebook she had started in April, small and plain, purchased without ceremony from Mrs. Finch's store, and filled each evening with observations. She was not yet calling anything, not yet claiming as anything in particular, just recording, because the act of recording felt like the return of something she had given up too readily. She had not told Cole about the notebook. She was not sure why. Only that some things need to grow in private before they can survive the open air. She had burned her private writing once already. She needed to be certain this time that what she was making was strong enough before she let anyone else know it existed. She turned Daisy back toward the house. She knew something had shifted the moment she came through the kitchen door. Cole was at the table. In front of him, the household account ledger open to the pages she kept for operational costs. Beside it, laid out with the careful precision of a man who has handled something he understands to be delicate, the invoices from Aldous Pemberton's office, the receipt for the initial consultation, the authorization letter bearing Cole's signature but drafted in Eleanor's hand, the correspondence she had kept in the back of the account ledger, folded small because she had not known where else to put something she had not decided how to talk about. He had been going through the quarterly accounts. He had found all of it. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway with the morning heat behind her and the stillness of the house in front of her. Cole looked up. He had the expression of a man who has been sitting with something long enough to understand it fully before he speaks. That particular quality of stillness she had learned over the past year was not silence but preparation. "December," he said. "You started in December." "Yes." "Before Vane's lawyers sent their letter. I found the adjudication document before they sent it," she said. "I wanted to understand what we had before they told us what they thought we didn't." Cole looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at the Pemberton invoices, modest amounts paid from the household account, with the same matter-of-fact notation as flour and lamp oil. He looked at the correspondence. He looked at his wife with an expression she had no previous category for. "You paid for it yourself," he said. "It's my household account." "It's our household account." "Then I paid for it from our household account," she said, "to protect our land." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the summer morning was advancing, the heat building its daily architecture, the light on the pasture going from gold to white. Cole stood up. He crossed the kitchen without hurry, the same unhurried quality in everything he did she had come to understand was not indifference but intention, and he went out the back door. She heard his boots on the porch steps. She stood where she was for a moment, uncertain, and then followed him out. He was standing at the edge of the yard, looking out at the south pasture, at the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek. His hands were in his pockets. His shoulders carried the particular set of someone who is feeling something large and has decided to feel it properly rather than quickly. Eleanor stood beside him. The creek was visible from here as a darker line through the pale summer grass. The same line it had always been, the same water running over the same stones, indifferent and essential, and exactly where Robert Hardin had intended it to be when he filed those papers in 1871. Cole did not look at her. He looked at the creek. My father dug the first channel himself, he said. 1870. Midsummer temperature over 100 degrees alone because he couldn't afford to hire anyone yet. He dug it with a hand spade and a determination that I think frightened people who saw him working. A pause. He told me once that every foot of that channel was a conversation with this land. He was asking it to cooperate with him, asking it to believe he was worth the effort. Eleanor said nothing. He spent 11 years asking, Cole said, and it answered. The cottonwoods moved in the distance. A hawk turned slow circles above the south pasture, patient and comprehensive in its attention to the ground below. He would have lost it, Cole said quietly. The debt vein, the water rights, without what you found, without what you did, I would have lost the creek. I would have spent the next 10 years hemorrhaging money to a man who waited for me to break the way he waited for everyone to break. He stopped. I would have lost the promise I made to him. He turned and looked at her then. The look on his face was the one she had been assembling a vocabulary for since September of 1883, since the platform at Hallbrook, since the kitchen table, since the stable door in the cold October night, since the February table with the letter between them. She had enough of the language now to read it. She had been learning it the way you learn a second language, slowly at first, full of errors and hesitations, and then suddenly with a fluency that makes you forget you were ever without it. He went inside. She stood in the yard a moment longer, listening to the creek and the hawks and the dry grass moving in the July heat. Then she heard the back door open again. Cole came out carrying the small tin cup he kept on the kitchen windowsill, the one that had always held pencils and was not for drinking and never had been. He had put something in it. He held it out to her. It was a flower, a single wild one, purple and small, the kind that grew in the rocky ground along the creek bank where the water kept the soil just damp enough. He had gone inside, found something inadequate, as a vessel found the only flower available on a working ranch in midsummer, and returned in under a minute. He held it out. She took it. He said nothing. He did not need to. She understood, with the precision she brought to everything that mattered, exactly what was being said. I see you. I saw what you did. I know what it cost you to do it quietly. And I am telling you in the only language I have that is adequate to it that it meant everything. She held the small purple flower in the morning heat and felt something in her chest complete emotion it had been engaged in since September of the previous year. Thank you, she said. No, Cole said. Thank you. They stood together in the summer yard in the silence that was by now the most articulate thing between them, filled with everything that had accumulated in the months since she had stepped off a train in a wool dress and looked for desperation and found patience instead. The notebook was full by October. She had not planned it. She had not set out to fill it with anything in particular, had told herself it was just observation, just the habit of attention applied to a life that offered more worth attending to than she had anticipated. But by October, when she turned the last page and found it covered in her own handwriting, she recognized what she had made. Not a journal. Not the private interior repository she had burned in Boston, filled with longing and story, and the particular ache of a young woman who feels too much in a world that rewards feeling too little. Something different, something turned outward. The landscape written from the outside in the way the light moved across the south pasture in late afternoon, the specific vocabulary of cattle moved across dry ground, the character of a winter storm coming down from the north, what Amos looked like when he was working through a problem, and what Cole looked like when he had solved one. The smell of bread in a stone kitchen at altitude. The way this country announced itself in the hour before dawn, all that dark space growing slowly specific, gaining back its details the way a photograph gains them in the developing tray incrementally, irreversibly. She had written it as though someone else might read it. That recognition that she had written it for a reader stopped her at the last page for a long time. She had not written for readers since she had burned the journals. She had not allowed herself to write for anyone, including herself. And yet here, without permission, without ceremony, she had done it again. She had found the room Mrs. Finch had spoken about without knowing she was looking for it. Mrs. Finch had a subscription to the Hallbrook Territorial Courier. Eleanor had read it during visits and formed opinions the way a person with strong language instincts forms opinions about language, noticing what was missing, what was flat, where the sentences gave up before they arrived at anything true. It was a functional newspaper. It was not, in her estimation, a particularly good one. She wrote a piece about the water dispute, not by name, not with any detail that name vein or the specific legal mechanism, but as a story about a family in a creek and the question of what a man owes the land he has promised to keep. She wrote it the way she had written the notebook turned outward for a reader. She wrote it in 3 drafts. The 3rd draft was honest and specific and moved at a pace that did not apologize for itself. She sent it to the Territorial Courier under the name E.A. Hardin. It was published 3 weeks later on page 2. She did not tell Cole she had sent it. She came home from Hallbrook with the newspaper folded under her arm and set it on the kitchen table at supper and said nothing about it. Cole picked it up after the meal the way he did every week and read it from the front page back. When he reached page 2, she watched his face and saw the moment he began reading her piece, the slight change in the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved differently through sentences that were doing something rather than simply reporting. He read it twice. He put the paper down. E.A. Hardin, he said. Yes. Ellie Hardin. Eleanor Ann Hardin, she said. I kept the initials ambiguous. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the same one he'd had over the letter from Pemberton. Rearranging, making room in his understanding for something that required more space than he had previously allocated. You can write, he said, not surprise exactly, confirmation of something he had suspected without having evidence for. I used to, she said. I stopped. I'm starting again. He nodded once slowly, the way he nodded when he had understood something fully and completely and intended to remember it. Then he folded the newspaper and set it down. That was all. But the following week, she noticed he had placed the newspaper in the kitchen drawer rather than in the kindling pile beside the stove. The letter from the Tucson Daily Star arrived in January of 1885. An editor named William Reese had read her piece in the Courier and was interested in regular contributions, observations on ranch life and territorial affairs from what he called a perspective not often represented in these pages. He offered a modest rate per column. He asked for a response at her earliest convenience. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Cole was out with Amos checking the herd after a cold snap. She read it twice. Then she sat for a long time with it in her hands and felt the specific kind of fear that comes when you are offered something you have wanted so long you have almost finished wanting it. The fear of the person standing on the edge of something they have spent a long time approaching, afraid that the approach is what they know and the arrival is unknown territory. She was afraid of writing badly and having the evidence published where people could see it. She was afraid of writing well and being expected to continue. She was afraid of the exposure of it, of putting her observations and her language into the world regularly and publicly, stripped of the ambiguity of the initials, understood by anyone who thought about it, to be the wife of the rancher on the property south of Hallbrook. She wrote back to William Reese that same afternoon and accepted. She told herself, if it's terrible, I'll stop. But I have to try. She had gotten on the train. She could do this too. The pieces appeared monthly at first, then twice monthly. The Daily Star had readers across the territory and into New Mexico. Her columns, she thought of them as letters to no one in particular, written from the specific address of a working ranch in southern Arizona, covered what she saw and heard, and understood the mathematics of cattle ranching, the language of drought, the particular democracy of frontier life that leveled men and women in ways the East had not yet figured out. She wrote about the difference between Eastern and Western silence. She wrote about what the land teaches patience to those willing to be taught. She wrote about the specific quality of a November dawn in the Arizona territory, which she spent 3 drafts trying to get right and on the 4th draft managed. She wrote about Cole once without using his name, describing the quality of attention a certain kind of man brings to land. He has inherited and chosen simultaneously the double ownership of obligation and desire, the way they reinforce each other until they become indistinguishable. She gave the piece to him to read before she sent it. He read it in the kitchen, standing up with his coffee going cold on the counter. When he finished, he stood there for a moment looking at the page. Is that how you see me? He asked. Yes, she said. He looked at the page again. Then he handed it back. Send it, he said. She sent on it. The response from readers was the largest William Reese had seen for any single column in his 8 years at the paper. He wrote to tell her so in a letter that contained the particular excitement of an editor who has found something he did not know he was looking for. Eleanor folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer with the first newspaper clipping. Cole said nothing when he noticed the drawer was getting full. He simply at some point that winter placed a small wooden box on the kitchen counter beside the drawer, plain pine sanded smooth with a simple latch. He said nothing about it. He went outside to work. She stood at the counter and looked at the box for a long moment. Then she moved the contents of the drawer into it. She understood without being told that the box had been made for this purpose, that he had built it sometime in the previous weeks in the evenings after supper, when she thought he was in the barn checking on a colt that had been unwell. He had been in the barn, she did not doubt that, but he had also been building a box for his wife's clippings, and she found she could not look at the box without feeling something in the region of her chest that she was no longer willing to call anything other than what it was. Their son was born in November of 1885. They named him Robert for Cole's father. He arrived in the world with his father's quality of stillness and his mother's quality of attention, and he grew in the particular way children grow on working ranches, practical and curious, simultaneously understanding early that the land was not scenery but character, not background but participant. Eleanor was present for his first steps, his first words, his first morning feeding the horses alone while Cole watched from the fence rail with the expression of a man who has received something he did not know how to ask for. She wrote about that morning too, not for publication, just for herself because some things needed to be preserved in the medium that allowed her to understand them most completely. A daughter followed in 1888. They named her Margaret. She was nothing like stillness. She was motion and question and the specific kind of persistence that runs in women who have decided the world is more interesting than it is frightening. She was in this respect her mother's daughter in the ways Eleanor had not expected to produce. Eleanor wrote around and between and through the rhythm of it all. She wrote in the early morning before the house woke in the brief afternoons, while the children slept in the evenings, when Cole was reading and the fire was doing its work and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a family that has found its shape. She wrote the way she ran the household accounts and managed the seasonal records and taught Robert and Margaret to ride as part of the texture of the life woven into it, not separate from it. The San Francisco Pacific Review published her first long essay in 1889. It was about what water means in a country where it is not assumed about the specific valuation of a thing that the East considers background and the West understands as foundation. She had been thinking about it since the day she first understood what the creek meant to Cole. The piece ran to 4,000 words and occupied the front of the journal's October issue. William Reese sent a note. "They're reading you in San Francisco now, Miss Harden. How does that feel?" she wrote back. Like something that was always true has been confirmed. September of 1898 came with the particular quality of Arizona autumns, the heat beginning its long withdrawal, the light-changing angles, the mornings carrying the first genuine suggestion of cold that would deepen slowly over the weeks ahead. 15 years. She counted them not as accumulation, but as texture, each one distinct, each one built on the previous one, the way the creek had built its channel year by year, the water finding and deepening the path that made the most sense. Robert was 12, Margaret was 10. The ranch ran 400 head now, double what it had carried when Eleanor arrived in September of 1883. Amos had slowed some, but remained with the permanence of something that has simply decided not to go anywhere, and his presence at the supper table on cold evenings remained one of the most reliable comforts of Eleanor's life. She had come to understand that some people become part of a place the way features of the landscape become part of a place not through drama or decision, but through simple, consistent presence over enough time. She was 37 years old. She did not feel like the woman who had stepped off the train in September of 1883. She felt like the woman that woman had been traveling toward without knowing it, the destination that had been there all along, waiting with the patience that the territory had taught her patience had, which was the patience of land itself, absolute and without urgency. Cole had told her the previous week that he had something for their anniversary. He was not a man who made gifts into occasions. He had given her things over the years, a good pair of riding gloves, a copy of a book she had mentioned, wanting a horse of her own, when Daisy grew old enough to retire to the East pasture, and he gave them the way he did everything without ceremony placed, where she would find them not requiring acknowledgement beyond the acknowledgement of use. She had learned to receive this way of giving as what it was, not negligence, but respect, the understanding that she did not need her gifts to be performed at her. So when he set the small wooden box on the kitchen table on the morning of their anniversary, she looked at it with genuine uncertainty. It was not the pine box she kept her clippings in. This was different. Older, smaller, darker wood with a brass latch that had developed the patina of something handled regularly over a long period. "Open it," Cole said. She sat down at the table. She opened the latch. Inside on top was a piece of paper she recognized immediately. Her handwriting, her phrasing, the particular sentence structures of a 22-year-old woman trying to sound older than she felt, trying to compress herself into the language of commerce because the language of feeling had failed her. "Mr. Harden, I am answering your advertisement in the Boston Herald dated August 14th. I am 22 years of age." She stopped reading. She looked up at Cole. "You kept it," she said. "From the day it arrived," he said. She looked back down at the letter. The paper had been folded and unfolded many times. She could see the evidence of it in the creases, could see where they had gone soft with repeated handling. He had read it, not once, not twice, many times over many years, refolding it each time along the same lines. "I don't know why exactly," Cole said. "At first, I think I kept it because it was the thing that started everything, and I didn't want to lose track of the beginning. Then later," he stopped. "Later, I kept it because every time I read it, I saw something different. In the beginning, I read a woman being practical. Then I read a woman being brave. Then I read a woman who had been so badly hurt that practical and brave had become the same thing for her." A pause. "Now I read it and I see the whole life we built compressed into one page. The whole thing contained in there, if you know how to read it." Eleanor held the letter carefully. She did not trust her voice. "Look underneath," Cole said. She lifted the letter. Beneath it, newspaper. Clippings folded with care stacked in a pile that filled the depth of the small box. She lifted the first one, the Territorial Courier, page 2 October 1884. E.A. Harden. Her first published piece, the one about the family and the creek and what a man owes the land he has promised to keep. Then the next, the Tucson Daily Star, February 1885. Then another, then another. 15 years of them. Every column, every essay, every piece she had sent into the world under the initials she had kept ambiguous, and the name she had taken in a small church in Hallbrook and found over time to be entirely her own. Not one was missing. She looked up at her husband. "You cut them out," she said. "Every one. From the beginning. From the first one," he said, "before you knew I was doing it, before you knew whether it would continue." He looked at her with 15 years of something in his face that had no simple name and did not require one. "I knew it would continue. I knew from the first one. You don't write like someone trying something. You write like someone who has finally found the room they were always supposed to be in." Eleanor looked down at the box, at the letter and the clippings, 15 years of her own words gathered and preserved by a man who had never once told her they were worth preserving while she was still afraid they weren't. Who had kept the evidence without being asked, without being thanked, without ever making it a gift until the moment it could mean the most. "Cole," she said. Her voice did exactly what she had expected it to do. "You wrote that letter to survive," he said. "Everything in this box you wrote to live. I watched you come back to yourself piece by piece, word by word, year by year. I kept the evidence because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you deserve to have someone keep it. Because someone should witness that return. And I was here, and I was paying attention, and it seemed like the least I could do." She was crying. She had cried in front of him before during the fever in certain late nights. When the accumulated weight of the year became briefly too much on the afternoon, she received word that Mrs. Finch had died of a stroke in the spring of 1892, simply and suddenly in the back room of her own store. But this was different from all of those. This was not grief or illness or relief. This was the particular kind of crying that belongs to the moment when you understand fully and without remainder that you have been seen. Not the version of yourself you performed for the world, not the careful, controlled surface, not the practical woman of the transaction. The whole of you seen and held and preserved by someone who chose to look. Cole reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He held it there. He did not say anything else because there was nothing else required, and he had always understood the precise weight that silence could carry when it was filled with the right intention. They sat like that for a long time in the September kitchen, with the anniversary morning light coming through the east window the way it had come through every morning for 15 years, and the clippings spread across the table between them and the house quiet around them, in the particular way of a house whose children have grown old enough to sleep past dawn. The book came from a publisher in New York in the summer of 1907. A letter from an editor named Thomas Carr at a house called Meridian Press, who had read her essays collected in a small regional anthology and wanted to know if she had considered a full-length work. He was interested, he wrote, in the unwritten history of the American West as experienced by those who lived it without performing it for Eastern audiences. She wrote back without asking Cole's opinion first. This was not because his opinion didn't matter. It mattered considerably, but because she had learned by 1907 that there are decisions which belong entirely to the person making them, and that the people who love you well understand this and do not require to be consulted before you claim what is yours. She told him afterward over supper. "A book," he said. Yes. He considered this. Robert, 22 now and increasingly in charge of the ranch's daily operations, looked between his parents with the expression of someone who has grown up watching two people communicate in a language that runs underneath words and has long since stopped being surprised by it. "When would you start?" Cole asked. "I've already started," she said. "The outline has been in my head for about 3 years." He almost smiled. "Of course it has." "You're in it," she said. "I assumed," he said. "You are not named." "I assumed that too." Robert made a sound that was not quite a laugh and served himself more potatoes. The book took a year and a half. She called it From Bargain to Belonging, a woman's account of life in the Arizona Territory. It was published in September of 1908, 25 years, almost to the month after she had stepped off a train in Hallbrook in a wool dress with 2 trunks and a letter, and nothing else she was willing to name. The reviews were serious, not sensational. She had written a serious book, and it received serious attention. Several journals in the East treated it as a document of historical value. A reviewer in the Atlantic Monthly wrote that it was the most honest account of frontier domestic life, yet committed to print, remarkable for its refusal to sentimentalize either the hardship or the beauty. She read the review to Cole at the kitchen table. He listened without expression until she finished. Then he said, "They left out funny. You're very funny in that book." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that arrives before you decide to allow it. Robert, who was eating breakfast across the table, looked up and grinned in the way of a young man who has been watching his parents make each other laugh since before he had language for what he was watching. Margaret, home for a visit from the school where she had begun teaching, looked at her parents and said, "You two are absolutely insufferable, you know that," and poured herself more coffee, and she was smiling when she said it. September of 1933 arrived the way all September arrivals in Arizona arrived, with that particular quality of light that the summer has been moving toward, all along the angle, changing the heat, finally beginning its long patient withdrawal. 50 years. The number was enormous when she said it aloud, and intimate when she felt it, because she did not feel 50 years so much as she felt the specific texture of each one, the way you feel the separate pages of a book you have read slowly and well. The ranch was Robert's now, formally for 3 years. He ran it with Cole's quality of steady attention and Eleanor's quality of rigorous accounting, and he had added 200 acres to the east and modernized the water system in ways that would have amazed his grandfather and satisfied him completely. Robert's son, their first grandchild, named James, who was 14, and already showing the specific quality of patience with difficult work that skips a generation and then arrives fully formed, had begun helping in the mornings. Margaret taught school in Tucson and came home for long visits and still had the persistence she had been born with, now directed toward the education of 47 children who would remember her for the rest of their lives. She had married a surveyor named Aldous, no relation to Pemberton, and they had 3 children, the youngest of whom was Clara. Clara was 9 years old and had the specific quality of a child who will remember everything she sees, who will carry the weight of witnessed things into her life with the care and precision of someone who understands, even at 9, that what you pay attention to is what you keep. There were 7 grandchildren in total at last count. The house on the evening of the anniversary held all of them, plus their parents and their various noises and appetites, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway at one point and looked at the full, loud, particular chaos of a family that had been building for 50 years and felt something she had no word for that was large enough. Something that contained gratitude and wonder and the specific satisfaction of a woman who had once been told by her own arithmetic that survival was the best she could hope for, and who had found year by year and choice by choice and morning by morning that she had been wrong. She had not been wrong to be careful. She had not been wrong to protect herself. She had been wrong only about what protection was for. Not an end in itself, not a permanent state, but a temporary measure while trust was being earned and tested and slowly, cautiously, irrevocably extended. On the evening of the anniversary, when the supper had been eaten and the family had finally gradually graciously departed or settled into other rooms, Eleanor and Cole sat together on the front porch in the last of the September light. She was 72. He was 80. He had slowed in the way that men slow when they have spent 50 years giving the largest part of their energy to physical work, not diminished, not less present, but quieter in the body, as though having made his arguments at full volume for long enough, he was now content to make them gently. His hand found hers on the armrest between them, the way it had been finding hers for decades, without looking, without deliberation, with the easy certainty of a river finding its channel. Clara appeared at the porch door in the last of the evening light, 9 years old and burning with the particular curiosity of a child who has just heard something interesting in the kitchen and needs it properly explained. "Grandma," she said, "Uncle Robert said you came here on a train, that you didn't know Grandpa before you came." "That's right," Eleanor said. "Were you scared?" She looked at the child. She looked at the land, the south pasture in the late September light, the cottonwoods along the creek bank where the water ran, as it had run for 50 years, the sky going from gold to deep blue above the western ridge line, doing what it had done every evening without asking her permission or requiring her witness. She looked at Cole, who was looking at the land with the expression of a man who has spent his life in conversation with a place and found it on balance the best conversation he has ever had. "Terrified," she said. "But you went anyway." "I went anyway." Clara thought about this with the seriousness of a child encountering an idea for the first time that she will carry for the rest of her life. "Why?" she said. Eleanor considered the honest answer. Not the simple one. The simple one was because I had no other option, which was true, but was the least of the truth. The full answer had taken 50 years to assemble and was still not complete because some things continue to reveal themselves as long as you continue paying attention. Because sometimes, she said, the most frightening path is the one that goes towards something rather than away from it. I had spent a long time running away from being hurt again. And one morning I understood that I could either keep running or I could try something different. She paused. So I got on the train. Clara looked at Cole. "Did you know she would come?" "No," Cole said. "I hoped." The word arrived simply and without decoration, the way Cole said everything that mattered. "Were you scared too?" Clara asked. Cole looked at the child with the patience he had always brought to questions worth answering. "Every day," he said. "Scared she'd find out she'd made a mistake. Scared I wouldn't be able to make it worth her while. Scared the land would fail, the herd would fail, the year would be too hard." A pause. Being scared doesn't mean you stop. It means the thing matters. Clara absorbed this with the thoroughness of someone storing it for future use. Then with the practicality of a 9-year-old who has gotten what she came for, she disappeared back inside, and they heard her reporting to someone in the kitchen with the confidence of a child delivering important news. The dark came in slowly, the way it came in this country, not a switch thrown, but a long, gradual deepening. The sky moving through its colors without urgency, the stars appearing one by one in the order they had always appeared, the same order they had appeared in September of 1883, when Eleanor had stood at a stable door in the cold and heard a man talk honestly to a horse, and understood for the first time that she had not come here to a transaction but to a life. The creek was audible from the porch, barely if you were quiet and listening, a small persistent sound in the dark water over stones, the same sound it had made in 1871 when Robert Hardin dug the first channel with a hand spade in the midsummer heat and asked the land to cooperate with him. The land had cooperated, the creek ran. It had run through drought years and flood years, in the years when everything else on the property was uncertain. It ran now in the September dark, indifferent and faithful, the way the best things are. "I've been thinking about the memoir," Eleanor said. Cole made a sound of acknowledgement. "I want to add a final chapter," she said. "I keep thinking about what I would tell a woman like the one I was, young and hurt, and convinced that the safest way to live was to want nothing you couldn't afford to lose." She paused. "I want to tell her something useful, something true." "What would you tell her?" She thought about it. The way she had thought about everything that mattered, not quickly, not for the sake of having an answer, but thoroughly because the question deserved it. "I would tell her that the transaction she was proposing was real," she said. "It wasn't foolish. She needed shelter and stability, and she found them. The transaction was real and it was honored." She paused. "But I would tell her that the transaction was the door, not the room. That what was on the other side of it, the life, the love, the return of herself, none of that was in the terms she had negotiated. All of that was extra. All of that was what happened when two people decided every single day to keep showing up for each other past the point where the contract required them to." Cole was quiet beside her. The creek ran in the dark. "She came here thinking love was a risk she couldn't afford," Eleanor said. "I would tell her that she was right. It is a risk. It was a risk. It remains one." She looked at her husband's profile in the dark, the white hair of the face that 70 years of this particular latitude had made into something that had moved well past handsome, into something better, the face of a person who has been present for their own life without flinching from any of it. But the cost of not taking it, the cost of living inside the walls she had built, was higher than she knew. She couldn't see that from inside the walls. She needed someone patient enough to wait outside them. Cole turned and looked at her. 50 years, he said. Not a day of it wasted. "Not one," she agreed. His hand tightened on hers. "Not much. Enough to be felt." Inside the house, she could hear the sounds of her family, the low voices of grandchildren being organized towards sleep by their parents. Robert's laugh from somewhere in the kitchen, the familiar creak of the third stair that had been creaking for 40 years and that she had stopped meaning to fix because it had become part of the house's vocabulary, part of its way of telling you where people were in the dark. She had come here with nothing she was willing to name. She was leaving, not tonight, not soon, but eventually, as everyone leaves with everything. The land stretched before them in the September dark, the same land Robert Harden had arrived at with $40 and a quarter section and a conviction that it could be made into something worth keeping. Cole had kept it. She had helped him keep it. They had made it into something neither of them could have made alone. And in the making of it, they had made something else as well. Something that had no entry in the ledgers, but that was as real as the water in the creek and as permanent as the land itself. That was, she thought, the plain and accurate definition of a partnership, not the merger of two people into one, not the disappearance of the individual into the couple, but two distinct people with their separate wounds and their separate strengths, choosing every day to stand beside each other and build something the world would still be able to see after they were gone. She had come here thinking marriage would be a transaction. She had not been entirely wrong. It was a transaction, but a transaction of a kind she had not had the language for at 22. Not an exchange of services for shelter, but an exchange of trust for trust, given in both directions, renewed daily, compounding over time into something that had no name in the vocabulary of commerce. Something that had its name in the vocabulary of the life she had lived. She looked out at the dark land and the stars above it and the sound of the creek in the distance, and she felt as she had been feeling for decades now. Not in every moment, but in enough of them, in moments like this one, precisely the specific and irreducible satisfaction of a woman who answered a letter, took a risk, survived the surviving of it, and found on the other side something she had stopped believing existed. A home, not the building. Not the land, though she loved both. The person beside her in the dark, holding her hand, watching the same stars moving through the same night, keeping the same silence, understanding, without being told what the silence contained. That was the home. That had always been the home. The stars burned on above Arizona territory, indifferent and magnificent, and Cole Harden held his wife's hand in the dark, and Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Harden, for 50 years and counting, let herself be held, and did not calculate the cost of it, and was not afraid. She thought about the letter she had written in a cold room on Beacon Street, standing at a desk because she had needed to feel something honest against her face. She thought about the journals she had burned, the pages curling and blackening, the ink going blue, then green, then nothing. She thought about the train journey and the heat on the platform, and the man who had walked toward her without performance, without the desperate urgency she had prepared herself to manage. She thought about all the places in the long story of those 50 years where she had almost stayed behind her walls. The moments when the risk had seemed too great, when the old arithmetic of loss had made its case so loudly that she had nearly listened. She thought about the stable door, and the frost on the grass, and the February letter, and the purple flower in a tin pencil cup. She thought about the wooden box with the brass latch that had been handled so many times the patina spoke of years. She thought every one of those moments required a choice, and every choice was made again in the next moment, in the next. I think, she said, that the final chapter should be about choosing. Choosing what? Cole said. Everything, she said. Choosing to stay when you could go. Choosing to trust when you have been hurt. Choosing to open a door that you know leads somewhere you have never been. She paused. And choosing to keep choosing every morning past the point where fear would stop you. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's a good final chapter, he said. I think so too. The night deepened around them. Inside the house, the grandchildren were being put to bed, and their voices came through the windows in the particular diminuendo of children being organized toward sleep questions, protests, the last resistance before quiet. The sounds of a house that was full and warm and had been built over 50 years into something that would outlast the people who had built it. Eleanor leaned her head against Cole's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat together in the dark on the porch of the house that Robert Hardin had built with $40 and a hand spade and a belief that the scrub land nobody wanted could become something worth keeping. The creek ran in the distance. The stars were abundant and indifferent and entirely beautiful. 50 years. Not one of them wasted, not one of them anything other than exactly what it had needed to be, the difficulty and the joy of it. The seasons of abundance and the seasons of loss, the daily choosing and the daily work and the daily small accumulations of trust that had built over time into something that felt from the inside like the most natural thing in the world. As though it had always been this way, as though she had always been here on this porch in this dark beside this man listening to this creek, as though the frightened woman on the train platform in Boston had not needed to be afraid at all, not because there was nothing to fear, but because what waited on the other side of the fear was worth every mile of the journey to reach it. She closed her eyes. She listened to the creek. She felt Cole's hand in hers, warm and certain, the hand of a man who had chosen her every morning for 50 years, and who would, she knew without question, choose her again tomorrow. She thought, this is what I would have told her. This is the thing I would have said to the woman standing at the fireplace with the journals, watching everything she had felt burn down to nothing. It is not the feeling that puts you at risk. It is the choice to give the feeling to someone who is not worth it. Find the one who is worth it, who shows you in actions rather than words, who is patient with your walls rather than impatient for them to fall, who keeps the evidence of who you are becoming when you have forgotten to keep it yourself. And then choose them. Every day. Without waiting to be certain, because the certainty comes from the choosing, not before it. Get on the train. The September night held the Hardin Ranch in its dark, and somewhere along the creek, the cottonwoods moved in a wind too gentle to feel from the porch, and the stars continued their ancient indifference. And Eleanor Hardin, formerly Marsh, held her husband's hand and was finally completely without remainder home.